Benito Mussolini's execution and subsequent treatment of his remains inside a square in Milan at the end of the Second World War shocked the world. The former fascist dictator of Italy had been shot by a roadside near Lake Como, and his remains, along with his mistresses, Clara Petacci, were dumped in the square in front of a crowd of dozens of thousands. But when the Americans arrived, the remains of Mussolini were unrecognisable, and they were then taken to a mortuary for autopsy. It was found that Mussolini had been shot 7 or 9 times, but there was a huge impact in Germany regarding Mussolini's execution. Hitler was deep underground inside of his bunker in Berlin, and he heard about Mussolini's remains and how they were treated, along with his mistresses, and he then realised that he did not want to be treated in this way, following the defeat of Nazi Germany, and the dictator of Germany then made arrangements for his death. However, Mussolini's remains were later stolen, and almost as soon as they were interred in an unmarked grave, Mussolini's body was taken and was hidden, before it was then reburied, around 12 years later. Join us today as we look at the exhumation and theft of Mussolini's body, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Benito Mussolini had fled his position as the head of the Italian Socialist Republic in the north of Italy, a Nazi puppet state. Peace negotiations between Mussolini and the Italian partisans had been unsuccessful, and he then, along with Clara Petacci, his mistress, went on the run to try and cross the Swiss border. He attempted to cross a number of times, but was unsuccessful. But on the 27th of April 1945, he joined a Luftwaffe convoy, which was heading back towards Germany. If he made it to Germany, Hitler would have given him sanctuary. However, the convoy was then attacked near to the village of Dongo, and there were a number of other fascists in the convoy, but then Mussolini was spotted. His demeanour was described as, his face was like wax and his stare glassy, but somehow blind. I read utter exhaustion but not fear. Mussolini seemed completely lacking in will, spiritually dead. Mussolini was then taken captive, and it was clear what would happen next. The partisans had declared that any prominent fascist would be executed and be sentenced to death, and Radio Milano said the following statement announcing his capture. The head of this association of delinquents, Mussolini, whilst yellow with rancour and fear and trying to cross the Swiss frontier, has been arrested. He must be handed over to a tribunal of the people so it can judge him quickly. We want this, even though we think an execution platoon is too much of an honour for this man. He would deserve to be killed like a mangy dog. Walter Ordizio the following day was dispatched to be the executioner and to pick up Mussolini and Petacci, and he was led to a farmhouse where they had been kept in secret. The pair were then taken in a truck to the entrance of the Villa Belmonte, and they were told to get out, before Walter Ordizio took a machine gun and fired into Mussolini and Petacci, killing them instantly. Some reports claim that Mussolini's final words were, "Aim at my heart," and that he was crying before he met his death. But then Mussolini would be then taken to Milan, where his executed remains were displayed in front of a huge crowd. His remains were a harrowing reminder of his fall from grace, and the bodies of the former dictator, his mistress and other fascists were then dumped on the ground in the Piazza Loreto. This was a place where a number of partisans had been executed before, and after the remains were dumped, the crowd turned against the former dictator. Mussolini was the man in Italy who was considered the most powerful man for decades, before he was ousted from power by his own government and by a council of powerful figures. But he was now lying dead in the square, and the public urinated, spat on, kicked, threw vegetables and punched his remains. His face was heavily disfigured, and the crowd were incredibly angry. His body was then strung up from a half-built service station there. The bodies, which were strung upside down as an act of disgrace, were then ordered to be cut down as the Allies arrived in the square, and the Americans said they wanted the remains to be taken to a local mortuary to be autopsied. At 2 p.m. on the 29th of April, the American authorities took possession of the bodies and took them to a morgue, where they were then autopsied. On the following day, Mussolini's autopsy was performed, and it was said that 7 or 9 bullets had killed the former dictator, and that 4 bullets near to the heart were the cause of death. Part of his brain was then sent to America to be studied, but no autopsy was performed on his mistress. But in the time whilst Mussolini was lying inside of the mortuary, Adolf Hitler was informed about the execution of his former friend, and he then dictated his last will and testament, and he greatly feared his remains being made a spectacle of. He would arrange for his body to be burned with petrol inside the Right Chancellery garden, and Mussolini's fate was a deciding factor in Hitler's decision to take his own life inside of his bunker. It was said, if he did learn of the full gory tale of Mussolini, it could have done no more than confirm his anxiety to take his own life before it was too late, and to prevent his body being seized by his enemies. But following the display of his corpse and the autopsy, the task then came to bury the former dictator of Italy. Mussolini's remains were taken to the Musocco cemetery in the north of Milan, and he was hastily buried in an unmarked grave, but it's believed that this location was not a secret at all. He was buried inside a wooden coffin with very little celebration. However, Mussolini would then be disturbed a short time after. There were many people at the time who remained fascist, and for them Mussolini was a godlike figure, and his body was something that needed venerating. With this, on the evening of the first anniversary of Italy's liberation from Nazi forces, a young right-wing journalist, along with two of his friends, decided to exhume Mussolini and his remains. Domenico Lessisi would later become a parliamentary deputy for the neo-fascist Italian socialist movement, but his most notorious act was to steal the remains of the former dictator. He and his two helpers snuck into the cemetery, and they then broke the ground. Mussolini's remains had been in the ground a number of months, and the coffin was then placed onto a truck, and it was driven very quickly away. Lessisi inside of the tomb left a note and said, "Finally, O Duce, you are with us. We will cover you with roses, but the smell of your virtue will overpower those roses." It was clear that it was former fascists that had stolen the body and remains, but now the authorities tried to find out where they were and who had stolen them. Italy was filled with fascists at the time, and many members of the clergy, including monks, were even sympathetic to Mussolini's cause, and Lessisi and his two helpers decided to hide Mussolini's remains inside of a church. They took it initially to a number of different places and moved it around to ensure that the authorities could not easily track it. It was hidden inside of a villa, but then Lessisi handed it over to a number of monks who hid it inside different churches and monasteries. But then information came forward about the coffin being taken into the Certosa di Pavia, which was a monastery relatively close to Milan. When they entered the monastic building, they came across the body of Mussolini, but strangely one of the legs of the dictator had gone missing, meaning someone had forcibly taken it, to possibly venerate this as a relic if the body was retaken. After this, two friars were then arrested and were charged with helping hide the body. But then the task of what to do with Mussolini's remains was debated, but the authorities for some reason believed that the best course of action and the best thing to do would to be continue to hide it. It was then taken to a Capuchin monastery in the town of Chieri Maggiore, and it stayed there for 11 years, pretty much locked inside of a cupboard. This was highly secretive, and Mussolini's own family did not even know what had happened to it. They wanted the former dictator's remains back inside of the family crypt, but the Italian government continued to appease them and to claim they did not know where it was. But then, following the appointment of Prime Minister Adonzoli, Mussolini's remains were then given to the family, and it was agreed that he would be reinterred at his place of birth, in Predappio in Romagna. It was slightly underhand, as the Prime Minister knew Mussolini's widow, and he needed the support of the far right. On the 1st of September 1957, what was left of Benito Mussolini was reinterred in a large tomb at the family crypt, and around his tomb today are relics related to his life, and each year on his anniversary of his death, there are a huge series of fascist marches to commemorate his death. But it's bizarre to think that a man who during the Second World War was so closely linked to Hitler is still commemorated today, and thousands each year flock to see his tomb and remains. It's possible that the story of his execution and subsequent posthumous display has given Mussolini a sense of notoriety and intrigue. But these are people who march and use his tomb as a place of pilgrimage, and these are people who still support his political ideas. However, Mussolini's remains following his execution went on a strange journey, with them being stolen and hidden for over a decade. But he is not buried completely, as his leg is still missing. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.